In Fairfield County, something new comes across my desk every day. Crimes are committed, cases are solved, and a community is made safe by the hardworking employees of the Fairfield County Sheriff's Office.
Welcome to This Week with Sheriff Dave Phelan, a weekly program here on LSN Television. We're also carried by a number of radio affiliates here in Lancaster. Do appreciate you, the viewers and listeners that join us each and every week. This show is actually taped at Fairfield Christian Academy by the students. They do a terrific job behind the scenes. Kelly Roberts, our executive producer. And we've got a great guest here for the next couple weeks, Colonel Tom Moe.
Hi, Dave.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And we've known each other for a while now, right?
We have.
Yeah. We've got a lot to talk about, and first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your history.
Well, I was born in Washington, D.C. and grew up in Virginia.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and but what brought me to Ohio is that I had been motivated to become a preacher. I was a Lutheran at the time, and there were some missionaries from another faith that were massacred literally in South America in the 50s. And I read about them in different publications, Pictures in Life magazine. And what really got to me about this story of these murders was that their wives stayed down there, continued their mission to this day, actually. And I think there's a book called Through Gates of Splendor that's been written in recent years about that. And so I said I needed to step in and take part, and wouldn't have half the courage that those women or the men had had. And so that brought me to Capital University in Columbus, here. And then as I looked deeper into it, and this wasn't a snap decision, my friends in high school called me Moses.
Okay.
Because I was going to be a missionary. And but when I got into pre-seminary, did more soul searching and decided that I just wasn't receiving the call to do that. And eventually really changed direction because I entered into Air Force ROTC training. At the same time I was in the Naval Reserve. Gets complicated, doesn't it?
Yes, wow, wow.
And when I graduated from college, I went into the Air Force.
Yeah. Well, I've got a little background in Washington because I was a policeman there at one time.
Very good.
So, and so you actually grew up outside of Washington.
In Arlington, in the shadow of
Yeah.
the Lee Mansion.
Yes.
Now Arlington Cemetery, where my parents are now buried.
Okay.
That was my home for 17 years.
So you've been in the military now, what, for 50 years?
I retired in 95, but
Okay.
counting my Naval Reserve time, I was in the military for 33 and a half years.
Okay. So then, at that time, you became a pilot,
I did.
and then you were assigned to Vietnam.
Right away. I knew when I went into the Air Force, and I wanted to be a pilot. That's really why I switched from the Navy to the Air Force. I would have been a Navy pilot, but my girlfriend, now wife of 50 years, said that she wasn't going to marry a Navy pilot and have me going off on all those cruises all the time.
There you go.
So I switched to the Air Force and wanted to fly fighter aircraft.
Okay.
And there was a war going on, and so I knew that things could get rough, but that's why you serve in the military, to defend our country. And so I signed up, went into pilot training, went right away to fighter training, and from fighter training went to Vietnam.
Okay. And so while you were in Vietnam, you had a rather life-changing event happen.
I did. Not as life-changing as some of my friends whose lives ended there, and I never forget them, ever.
Right.
But due to a mechanical difficulty with one of the fuses that we were using on our bombs, a number of my mates were being killed. And finally, it's a very long, complicated story. I was knocked out of the sky by the same bad fuse. So instead of being shot down by the enemy, I was blown out of the air by an American manufacturer. Pretty
Okay.
sad.
Yes.
And there were four of us. 4 pilots went down. And I was able to evade the bad guys for 3 days, and they were just all over the place, shooting at me even as I came down in my parachute. But after 3 days, they were able to listen actually to the rescue radios and use that to locate me and close in on me. And so I was then captured and then spent the next 5 years as a prisoner of war in Hanoi.
Now, for a relatively young man, that must have just been, I don't know, terrorizing, I guess. I don't know. How did you kind of work through that?
Well, I think the good news as far as survival was that I was young. I was 23 when I went to Vietnam. A number of my mates up in Hanoi were considerably older. Some of them were full colonels, certainly in their 40s. And so I was young. I was in good shape. I always maintained my health, which a pilot would have to do anyhow. And
Right.
And so physically, I was able to withstand the harsh treatment, the poor diet, the exposure to the elements, and so forth. And certainly had lots of opportunity to evaluate my faith under very tough circumstances. And it's hard to say in one case that it made my faith stronger, because my faith's always been pretty strong. But when it's challenged in certain ways, at least and I don't know about other people, probably there are many more with stronger faiths than I ever had, but I went through a cycle of, and I've written about it actually, a cycle of anger, a cycle of pity, why me, and all these sort of things that I actually am almost embarrassed to admit. But under these harsh conditions, being beat up every day during some periods, starving, also with the enticement that the enemy was always offering some of us to go home early. Of course, I would never accept that and didn't, but
Right.
still, it gnaws at you that you can stop this agony. And my faith was made stronger than ever. I got over the anger. I don't hate anybody or anything anymore. I did for a while. I don't feel sorry for myself. That didn't last long anyhow. And I'm grateful that I could come home, see my parents again. One of the things I prayed most fervently for was to see my family, my little girl, and my parents.
Now, were you able to have a Bible or anything while you were in captivity?
Yes and no.
Okay.
And this story about the Bible is, to me, just one of those almost miraculous things. So, no, we didn't have a Bible. We were, for many, many years, kept in isolation or maybe with one or two cellmates. And but one Christmas Eve, we were actually living in a room with a lot of guys, about 60 guys. After the U.S. had tried to raid one of our camps, they consolidated the prisoners into these large rooms because they thought they could watch over us better. It was back in the prison we called the Hanoi Hilton, and it was in a section we'd never lived in, huge rooms. So we were taking advantage of these crowds, and even though we were stuffed in these rooms, we had about 18 inches of sleeping space per person on a slab of concrete, but we loved it. We would do plays, we had church services on Sunday, and we had a choir. And one Christmas Eve, the guards opened the door and brought in a Bible and a bottle of wine and said, "This is for you to have communion."
Really?
Communist, atheistic government would torture us and beat us when we would sing hymns. They thought we were doing political rallies, which tells you what their point of view is. And so here we had a bottle of wine for communion and a Bible. It almost chokes me up just to even say it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That spirit
Yeah.
was getting to somebody.
Right. Right. And then another person that I think most of our viewers and listeners recognize is John McCain. Now, was he in close proximity during that time? Is that someone that, because I know
He
that
was.
during his presidential run a few years ago, you were involved in his campaign.
I was.
And was he part of the group that was in there during that time?
Yes, and when the POWs were consolidated in the Hilton, we had been actually living in other camps. There were still a few in the Hilton in the smaller rooms, but there were many camps in North Vietnam. And in one of those camps that we called the plantation, we always called things something to make them sound better than they were. Hanoi Hilton,
Right.
plantation.
Right.
Okay. In the plantation, I was actually living next door to John, but our rooms didn't touch each other. There was a walkway between them. So we couldn't tap on the wall, which is the way we usually communicated, or we talked through the wall. But we could put our fingers under the door, because the rooms were at an angle. We could sort of waggle our fingers at each other. And then if we went by each other's door, we would, on the way to a quiz or to wash maybe, we would give some comment through the door like, you know, hang in there, cheer up, or whatever. And he was a real inspiration to me, even though we never really spoke to each other. And the reason I say that, his father was a four-star admiral, and at the time was the commander of the entire Pacific Theater. The position is called CINCPAC, the Commander-in-Chief Pacific. And so when John was captured, he was considered to be the great blue chip prize of the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, because they knew who his father was. And there was a lot of pressure on him. And he was, first of all, terribly injured when he ejected. Broken bones, et cetera, no medical care. And then the pressure put on him. And when he would go out to a quiz or go to wash, I would sit there and I'd look through a little hole in the door that I drilled with a piece of wire. And he was all bent over, couldn't stand up straight, and he'd hobble along. And he knew I was looking through the door because I'd cough or something so he could hear it. And he'd look over at me when the guard wasn't looking and just give me a huge thumbs up, which I would do for him as well.
Right.
This strength, this resilience never went away.
We got about 2 minutes left. When you got the news that you were going to be released, what was your thoughts at that time, if you remember? I mean, that had to be just unbelievable, because you probably weren't sure once you were originally captured whether you were even going to make it that long.
You know, I've spoken to prison people here in Ohio prisons, and I've told the prisoners, we talk about faith and keeping strong and making your life better. But I told them one of the big differences between what they are experiencing, what I was experiencing, they know they're either in prison for life or they're in for 10 years or whatever. There was no end to where we were going to be. And so
Right.
when we were told we were going home, there wasn't much emotion involved. It's like, I'll believe it when I'm over the Pacific Ocean headed to some friendly place. And so I didn't feel much emotion at all.
Just about out of time. We're going to have you back next week. Talk about a little bit about once you got released, some of the things that happened, and then certainly we're going to talk a lot about the World War I Centennial Commission, which you are a big part of, and maybe even talk a little bit about World War I. It really is the war that in many ways is a forgotten war. I think many people know a lot about World War I, Korea, Vietnam, Civil War, those kind of things. But a lot of people do not have a great familiarity with World War I, so maybe we can learn a little bit about that too.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
Colonel Tom Moe, former prisoner of war, American patriot, and certainly a wonderful guy. The clock on the wall says we've got to go. Until next week, same time, same place. God bless, and we'll see you right here next week.